Winter, 1241. A scout crests a frozen ridge above the Danube. Below him, ice floes drift past the walls of a city that has never known an enemy like this at its gates. Vienna, the eastern bastion of the Holy Roman Empire. Inside those walls, priests are praying. Knights are sharpening blades they already suspect will not be enough. Rumors race through the streets faster than any army could. Stories of riders from the edge of the known world. And force so vast it blackens the horizon. An enemy that has never lost a major battle, it chose to fight. This is not myth. This is the Mongol Empire, and its Western army, arguably the most lethally efficient military machine the medieval world had ever produced, stands less than 100 miles from Vienna's gates. Then, without warning, it turns around. It rides east, and it never comes back. For nearly 8 centuries, historians have argued over a single question. Why did the most successful conquering force in human history, an army that had already broken China's northern dynasties, shattered the Khwarezmian Empire, and burned Kiev to the ground, stop at the exact moment Western Europe lay open and defenseless before it? Was it politics? Was it the land itself? Or did the Mongols simply get everything they came for? This is the story of the campaign that nearly rewrote the map of Europe, and the strategic puzzle that still divides historians today. To understand why the Mongols stood at Vienna's doorstep in 1241, you have to understand the machine that got them there. 3 decades earlier, a man born Temujin had unified the fractured, warring tribes of the Mongolian steppe into a single, disciplined nation under a new name, Genghis Khan. What he built was not simply a horde. It was arguably the most sophisticated military organization on the planet, built on a decimal command structure of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, where promotion was earned through competence rather than bloodline, and where discipline was absolute. Every Mongol warrior rode with a string of remounts, allowing armies to move at a pace no European or Chinese force could match, often covering 60 miles a day, an almost unthinkable speed for the 13th century. Their composite bows, engineered from horn, sinew, and wood, could outrange contemporary European crossbows while being fired from horseback at a full gallop. And layered over this tactical superiority was something even more devastating: a deliberate, calculated use of terror. Cities that surrendered were often spared. Cities that resisted were made into examples so horrifying that the next city down the road rarely resisted at all. Just as important as the army itself was the intelligence apparatus that moved ahead of it. Mongol Khans invested heavily in merchant networks, defectors, and captured envoys to map the political fault lines of every kingdom they intended to strike. Which rulers distrusted each other? Which cities were undefended? Which roads froze solid enough to bear the weight of a cavalry column? By the time a Mongol army appeared on the horizon, its commanders often understood the target's internal weaknesses better than the target's own neighbors did. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire already stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea. His successor, his son Ögedei Khan, inherited not just territory, but a war machine that had never stopped moving forward. In 1235, at a great Kurultai, a formal council of Mongol princes and generals, Ögedei made a fateful decision. The empire's western frontier, the vast steppe corridor stretching toward Russia and Europe, would be the next target. Command was given to Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis through his eldest son Yoki. But the true architect of the campaign to come was a man in his 60s who had already spent a lifetime perfecting the art of Mongol warfare. The General Subutai, widely regarded by military historians as one of the finest strategic minds of the pre-modern world. The Western campaign did not begin with Europe. It began with the destruction of the Volga Bulgars and the Cuman-Kipchak Confederation on the steppes north of the Black Sea, a campaign of subjugation that, almost as an afterthought, produced the spark that would eventually pull the Mongols toward Hungary. Cuman refugees, fleeing westward, sought shelter under the protection of King Belethen IV of Hungary. In Mongol political logic, this was not a humanitarian gesture. It was harboring a fugitive enemy of the empire, and it demanded a response. But first came Russes. Between 1237 and 1240, Batu and Subutai's armies methodically dismantled the fractured principalities of Kievan Rus' one after another. Ryazan fell in December 1237 after refusing to submit. Its destruction was so total that chroniclers described it as a city that simply ceased to exist. Vladimir Suzdal fell weeks later. The Mongols used the frozen rivers of the Russian winter as highways, moving siege trains and cavalry across terrain that should have been impassable, catching Russ's principalities that had assumed the winter would protect them. Much of this siegecraft was itself borrowed and refined, Chinese and Persian engineers, absorbed into the empire during earlier campaigns, had given the Mongols access to counterweight trebuchets and incendiary weapons that let them reduce fortified towns far faster than European armies believed possible. By December 1240, Kiev itself, the spiritual and political heart of Russ's civilization, had been reduced to rubble. The road to Central Europe now lay open, and Subutai, ever the strategist, did not intend to strike it with a single army. In the spring of 1241, Subutai executed one of the most sophisticated pieces of operational planning in medieval military history, a coordinated, simultaneous two-pronged invasion, separated by hundreds of miles, timed to prevent Poland and Hungary from reinforcing one another. To the north, a smaller force under the princes Baidar and Kadan tore through Poland, drawing together a coalition of Polish knights, German heavy cavalry, and even a contingent of Templar knights under Duke Henry II, the Pious of Silesia. On April 9, 1241, at the Battle of Legnica, this coalition was annihilated. The Mongols used feigned retreats, a classic steppe tactic, to break the disciplined charge of European heavy cavalry, then encircled and destroyed it. Duke Henry himself was killed, his head reportedly displayed on a spear outside the city of Legnica as a message to the rest of Europe. 2 days later, and hundreds of miles to the southeast, the real target of the campaign met its reckoning. At the Battle of Mohi, on April 11, 1241, Batu and Subutai's main army confronted the field forces of King Belat IV of Hungary, by far the largest army the Mongols faced during the entire campaign. What followed was a masterclass in encirclement warfare. The Mongols used mangonels and possibly early gunpowder-based incendiary weapons to bombard the Hungarian camp, forced a controlled retreat to create a false gap in their lines, and then close that gap once the panicked Hungarian force tried to flee through it. Contemporary estimates suggest tens of thousands of Hungarian soldiers and nobles were killed in the encirclement and the pursuit that followed. Belikar himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing first to Austria and eventually to the Dalmatian coast. In the span of 48 hours, the two great military powers standing between the Mongols and the heart of Europe had been broken. What followed was, for Hungary, a catastrophe with few parallels in medieval European history. Through the remainder of 1241 and into early 1242, Mongol forces occupied and pillaged the Hungarian plain. Chroniclers of the period describe famine and devastation so severe that some regions reportedly lost the majority of their population to violence, starvation, or flight. Mongol raiding parties pushed further west and south than at any point before or since. Reconnaissance columns reportedly reached the outskirts of Wiener Neustadt, within striking distance of Vienna itself, while other detachments pursued the fleeing King Belat IV all the way to the Adriatic coast, raiding the Dalmatian city of Split. Panic spread across Western Europe. Pope Gregory IX called for a crusade against the invaders. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II exchanged urgent letters with other European monarchs, warning that the entire continent stood at risk. Yet no unified European army ever materialized to meet the Mongols in the field. The political fragmentation of 13th century Europe meant that the response, unlike the Mongol invasion itself, was slow, disorganized, and fundamentally reactive. And then, in the spring of 1242, the Mongol armies simply began to withdraw. Not in defeat, not in retreat under pressure, in good order, back east, across the very territory they had just conquered. Europe had been spared. But why? This is the question that has occupied military historians for generations, and there is no single, universally accepted answer. What exists instead is a set of competing, and possibly complementary, explanations. Theory 1. The succession crisis. This is the traditional, most widely cited explanation. On December 11, 1241, Great Khan Ögedei died in Mongolia, thousands of miles from the Hungarian plain. Under Mongol political law, the selection of a new Great Khan required a kurultai, a formal council that senior Chinggisid princes, including Batu himself, were obligated to attend. News of Ögedei's death likely reached Batu's camp in early 1242. And with succession politics already tense, Batu had a well-documented rivalry with Ögedei's son and heir apparent, Guyuk. The argument goes that Batu could not afford to remain campaigning in Europe while the empire's leadership was being decided without him. In this reading, Europe was not saved by its own strength, but by the accident of a succession clock ticking on the other side of the world. Theory 2. The ecological and logistical limit. A newer generation of historians and paleoclimatologists has proposed a very different explanation, rooted not in politics, but in grass. Mongol warfare depended on enormous horse herds. Each warrior typically maintained several remounts, meaning an invading army required staggering quantities of pasture to sustain itself. Tree ring and climate proxy studies of the Hungarian plain, published in the 2010s, suggest that the years 1241 and 1242 were unusually wet, turning much of the open grassland the Mongols needed into marsh and mud, and sharply reducing the grazing capacity available to sustain their cavalry. Some historians argue this ecological bottleneck alone may have made a prolonged occupation of Hungary, let alone a further advance into the forested, hillier terrain of Western Europe, logistically unsustainable, regardless of what was happening back in Mongolia. Theory 3. Mission accomplished. A third school of thought challenges the very premise of the question. In this view, the Mongols were never attempting a permanent conquest of Western Europe at all. Their original grievance was narrow and specific. Hungary's sheltering of the Cuman refugees, the empire considered its rightful subjects. Having crushed Hungary's field army, killed or scattered its ruling class, and devastated its ability to resist, the campaign's punitive objectives had arguably already been achieved. Reconnaissance raids toward Vienna, in this reading, were exactly that, reconnaissance, not the vanguard of an intended occupation. Theory 4. Diminishing returns. Finally, some historians point to signs, admittedly more subtle, that the campaign was becoming harder, not easier, the further west it went. Stone-walled towns and fortified positions in Hungary and Austria, unlike the more lightly defended cities of the Russ's principalities, proved considerably more costly and time-consuming to reduce. Supply lines stretching back thousands of miles to the Mongolian heartland were reaching their practical breaking point. The dense forests and mountain passes of the Alps and the German states, unlike the open steppe the Mongol cavalry was built for, would have neutralized much of the mobility advantage that had won every battle so far. Whatever the deciding factor, the campaign had already pushed further, faster and more successfully than any Mongol army before it, but continuing indefinitely was a fundamentally different proposition than continuing. For one more season, most modern historians now favor an integrated explanation. The succession crisis provided the immediate, undeniable trigger for withdrawal, while the ecological and logistical strain made that decision considerably easier to accept. Politics gave the order. Geography made it the right one. The Mongols never returned to Central Europe in force. Batu Khan would go on to found the Golden Horde, ruling over Russ's territories for over 2 centuries, fundamentally reshaping the political trajectory of Eastern Europe and Russia. The princes of Moscow, Novgorod, and the other Rus cities would spend the next 240 years paying tribute to Mongol descended Khans, a period Russian history remembers as the Tatar yoke, and one that historians still credit with quietly redirecting Russia's political development away from the rest of medieval Europe entirely. Guyuk Khan was elected Great Khan in 1246, 4 years after the withdrawal, vindicating in hindsight the urgency of Batu's return, but the counterfactual has never stopped fascinating historians. Had Ögedei Khan lived another decade? Had the Hungarian plain been drier that fateful spring? The Mongol war machine that annihilated Poland's knights and Hungary's army in a single week might well have continued into Austria, into the fractured German states, into a Western Europe with no coordinated force capable of stopping it. Instead, one of history's great near misses passed quietly into memory, decided not on a single battlefield, but by the death of one man 5,000 kilometers away, and perhaps by the mud of a wet Hungarian spring.